We're going to start the next part of our unit on the central nervous system, and we're going to get into one of my favorite topics to talk about and study, and that is the brain. Our understanding of the brain is still very minimal compared to our understanding of the rest of the body. The brain's not an easy thing to study. It's in your cranium, and it doesn't look like it's doing anything when it's working. Like, for example, the heart, it's beating. You can tell a lot about how the heart is functioning. You can hear it. You can study it in that sense. You can see if you're having issues with, when your blood, you can pull blood and you can see, oh, my liver's not working as well, or my kidneys aren't doing what they're supposed to do. The brain, on the other hand, it's just kind of sitting there, and it's sitting in the cranium, and it's doing a lot, obviously, but not in an obvious way. So to study the brain is not an easy thing. Our technology has improved vastly over the last 5 to 10 years, and we're getting a lot better at being able to determine what's happening inside of your cranium when you're doing different activities, but we still have a long way to go. So what we're going to do in this first lecture is I just want to talk about the brain itself and what the different components are. We're going to talk structurally about what's happening with the brain, and we'll get a little bit into the cerebrum, which is really what separates our brain from other animals. So if you take a look here, this is a sagittal cut of the skull, and you can see the different components of the brain. And as you can see, there's different areas, and they're different colors. But there's 5 major areas of the brain, and we're going to look at all of them and see how they interact with each other. We have the cerebrum, which is this large yellow area here, and as I said before a moment ago, and we're going to dive into this, this is the part of the brain that separates us from other animals. Then we have our basal ganglia and diencephalon, which are going to be in this area right here. And we'll talk, obviously, about what all these things do. Then we have our brainstem, which is this pink area down here. And then finally, we have the cerebellum back here. Now, each level of the brain has different jobs. And I'm going to compare this to something. Now, you can look at the brain and you can follow through evolution, on this evolutionary scale, and you can see the development of the brain, different organisms, as you go up that evolutionary ladder. So I like to compare it to something that, you may have seen this happen before. You may have even had a scenario where this happened to you in your house. So let's say I bought my first house, and it's this little, it's a nice little house, but small, really small, and doesn't have a lot going on. It's got a little garage, but not a whole lot happening. And at a certain point, I've outgrown this house. I got a better job. I'm making some more money. So, maybe I want to move, right? I want to get into a bigger house, but I don't really have enough money for that. But what I do have enough money for is I can put on maybe an addition. So, I'm going to throw an addition on this house, throw a second floor on. Much bigger. I know there's still a roof there, but you get the point, right? And now, I have a much bigger house now. I got a lot more I can do. I threw in some extra rooms, and it's still not, I work another bunch of years, and now at this point I'm invested in this house. So I don't want to move at this point. I like my property, so I'm going to maybe add another addition on at a certain point. And, now my house is huge. It's a little wavy looking, but you get the point, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is I keep building. Is the original house still there, that basic, very basic house that just had maybe 1 bedroom and a kitchen? Yeah, and then I kept adding to it. And that is essentially how the human brain was built, where you have levels of that brain. So if I go back to my diagram in the notes here, you can kind of compare it with that. So there's a couple terms I'm going to throw out there. You may have heard this before. It's called the reptile brain. And the reptile brain is essentially what reptiles have. And it's the most basic form of a brain. And the reptile brain is that original house that you lived in, that small house. And that is really going to be your brainstem and your cerebellum. This part of the brain is really responsible for keeping you alive. This is the thing where, if the top part of your brain stops functioning, as long as this part of your brain still works, you're going to stay alive. So if you've heard of people that are in a coma before, they're alive, they're breathing, their body's functioning, but they're asleep, essentially. That's an example of where the reptile brain is still working, but other components are not. So that's that initial part of the brain. And then evolution, and then you get this middle part of the brain, which they consider the mammalian brain. So as mammals started to develop, the brain started to develop with them. And the mammalian brain is going to be the center area here, which is going to be that diencephalon and basal ganglia. Now, this is the emotional center of the brain. This is the part of the brain that takes in information and reacts to it. Now, when I say emotions, I'm not talking about happy or sad, really. I'm talking about angry. I'm talking about physical emotion that makes you react. So fear is an emotion that will save your life if you're in a dangerous situation. Anger might save your life if it allows you to fight your way out of a situation. So that's going to be your emotional center. And then that last addition, that big, fancy addition that you put on, the last thing, that's going to be this, what we consider the primate brain, which is the cerebrum. So the brain was built by evolution to become more complex as it goes. And I like to think of it that way because it really lets you understand the complexity of the brain and how the brain works in terms of how the different areas communicate with each other. So this is the cerebrum up here. This is what we consider the human brain, or the primate brain. And this is the part of the brain that allows us to think. When we think, when you think of what we're able to do with our brains, that's because of this upper portion here, which is the cerebrum. So let's talk a little bit more about the cerebrum. It is the largest part of the brain, and it's really broken into two halves. Let me move my face so you can see that image up there. So you can see up here we have our cerebrum, and it's the portion of the brain that you think of when you think of the brain. It looks like a bowl of spaghetti, right? And we're going to talk more about why it looks like spaghetti in a minute. But you can see it has two hemispheres. It's split in half, and it's actually connected. Those two halves are connected to each other by a structure called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is what allows the right part of your brain to communicate with the left part of your brain. There's actually a procedure where they'll cut the corpus callosum in a patient that has really bad epileptic seizures, because one of the things they found is one side of the brain can trigger the other side of the brain in an epileptic seizure. So when they cut that, it helps isolate, I guess, the hemispheres, and it has a huge impact on epileptic seizures. And the brain can still function, but, obviously you want that corpus callosum if you can. Now, the next thing I want to point out to you are these little ridges, right? If you look at the brain, you can see here in these images, I have some examples of different animals and what their cerebrums look like compared to each other. And what I want you to notice is all those little crevices, all those little diving down parts, the grooves, they don't look the same in all of them. So like the humans have a good amount here. This elephant has even more folding. The dolphin has a huge amount of folding. And then you look at some of these other animals and they don't have much at all. Like they're flat. They look very flat. And if you were to think about it and you compare the executive functioning of these different animals, the ability to think and conceptualize, it makes sense if you take a look here. The folds kind of correlate. So the more folding there is, the more capable that organism is of having these thoughts or these ideas. And that is because it allows for more brain matter. I've said this before and I'll say it again. Anytime you see folding in biology in general, but specifically in anatomy, it serves a purpose, and that purpose is surface area. So the human brain is packed into our cranium, right? And the way that happens is by having all these folds. So they're called convolutions, and there's two types of convolutions. There's sulci, which are the grooves, and then there's gyri, which are going to be the folds. And the grooves actually are broken into things called fissures, and I'll talk more about the fissures in a moment. So the sulci are going to be these grooves, and then gyri, and I should have that in the notes. I don't know why it's not in there. Gyri. The gyri are going to be the bumps. And what they found is actually if you were to spread the brain out, flatten it out, so take all those folds and flatten them out, they're about 2.5 meters squared. So imagine like a 6-foot square table. That would be the size of your brain if you were to flatten it out. So by bunching it all together, you can get more brain matter in there. And obviously the more brain matter, the more neurons, the more function you have. So you can really see the difference in these animals. Now, does that mean that elephants and dolphins are more intelligent than us? We don't know. But what we do know is that they have as many folds, or in the case of the dolphin, more folds. Most likely it's because they have a smaller brain cavity. So, our craniums are larger. Our heads are built for the size brain we have. Dolphins are not. So in order to make it work for dolphins, they have to make more folds. But dolphins are extremely intelligent, and we don't know how intelligent they are because we can't communicate with them with language. So, a couple more terms, then we'll finish up for this lecture. Fissures. So if you take a look here, you can see there's an obvious dark line in this separating the left and right hemispheres. That is called a fissure. And there's two different fissures in the brain. First of all, there's the longitudinal fissure, which is the one that you see right here. And that is splitting the right and left hemispheres. So, I have my brain model right here. I can split it apart. This is the longitudinal fissure. And longitudinal, hopefully that makes sense. Longitude and latitude, And then the second fissure, you can see here very well, and that is going to be the transverse fissure. And that's what separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. And We talked about that before earlier in this unit. That's the tentorium cerebelli, which is going to separate those two. If I go back to the longitudinal fissure, we have our falx cerebri, which separates these. And then if I were to look at the cerebellum, it is also divided in half, and that's where we have the falx cerebelli. But that's just going back to some older notes. And then lastly, the cerebral cortex is going to be this gray outer ring. That is where you're going to have the cell bodies. So you've probably heard of the cerebral cortex before. You've probably heard of the gray matter of the brain. And I'm going to finish up with this idea here. So we have this ring of, essentially outer ring of gray matter, which goes along the outer ring of the brain. And I'll find a good image of that for you guys to look at. And that is where the cell bodies are. And then the white matter is under the gray matter, and that makes up most of the cerebrum, and that is going to be where we have our axons going out of the brain, out to the body. So if you look at my little brain model here, you can see we have our cerebral cortex, which is this gray matter to the outside. That is where we'd have our cell body. So this would be our cell body here with our dendrites, and then the axons would travel down the spinal cord, and that's the white matter. So this would be the myelinated, or the white matter, and this would be the unmyelinated, which would be the gray matter. And, you know, our brain is made up of trillions of neurons making trillions of connections. So it's going to be a lot of gray matter up there. But this is where, you know, that's what we think of when we think of the thinking part of our brain, is that cortex. And humans have a very impressive cerebral cortex. Thank you very much.